Howdy, Immortalium here, and today I'm going to be reviewing A Drifting Life by Yoshihiro Tatsumi. Just before I start reviewing A Drifting Life, I've got to explain who Yoshihiro Tatsumi was. So, Yoshihiro Tatsumi, basically he founded the Gekiga movement. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what the Gekiga movement was, it was a movement that rose in 1950s Japan, lasted for quite a while, I think right up to the 1970s. And basically, it called for manga to be accepted as a legitimate medium for drama, to be part of the adult readership. Prior to the Gekiga movement, manga was basically just aimed at children. It was just a children's medium. But through the introduction of realistic storytelling, more realistic artwork, more dramatic paneling, manga essentially became a legitimate medium. It gained the acceptance of literary critics. And Yoshihiro Tatsumi was right at the forefront. Now, A Drifting Life is actually Yoshihiro Tatsumi's autobiography. It's set between 1945, which is the end of the Second World War, right up to 1960, and it covers, how his passion for manga, how he got into the manga industry, how he became dissatisfied with the manga industry, and how he developed the Gekiga movement. So there's a lot covered in this manga. So let's just give a kind of a brief introduction to what the story is. So, Yoshihiro Tatsumi actually doesn't call himself Yoshihiro Tatsumi. He calls himself Hiroshi Katsumi. I'm not exactly sure why, but I hear that there's a couple of other characters in this that had name changes as well. I'm not sure why. But basically, Hiroshi Katsumi, he doesn't have the best home life at the beginning of the story. He has a brother who is pretty sickly. He has to go to hospital very frequently in order to get checkups to recover. Their parents can't see eye to eye. They're constantly arguing, and it's a very unpleasant home life. However, in spite of all this, Hiroshi Katsumi has a real passion, along with his brother, for manga. In particular, the works of Osamu Tezuka. They see him as an absolute genius. And they also submit their own manga, their 4-panel gag manga, to the manga magazines at the time. And usually they aren't accepted, but when they are accepted, the manga magazines send them a medal, just to commemorate the fact that their manga got published in the magazine. Now, as time goes on, more and more of Hiroshi's works are accepted in these manga magazines, to the point where a newspaper actually shows up and says, let's have a roundtable discussion of what manga is, of the manga medium, in which they actually bring in Osamu Tezuka, which of course Hiroshi is absolutely delighted with. Osamu Tezuka is his idol, and he's absolutely adores the fact that he can actually talk to Osamu Tezuka, and he's able to talk to Osamu Tezuka about what manga is, about how it works as a medium, about where it needs to develop, and their ideas on manga. And that's how the story begins. And over the course of this story, we see so much of Hiroshi's life. There's so many things in this. For one, this is a slice of life. So we're able to see how families were living at the time, between 1945 to 1960. How Japan was developing, how it was recovering from the war. In fact, something that's really interesting is Yoshihiro Tatsumi. He includes at certain points in the story, like the major events that are happening in Japan at the time. So, like for example, a wrestler might have won like the world championship, or like a song became particularly popular at the time, and that I found really interesting. Because it's just these little dollops, like it doesn't drag the story down, it might be just one panel long, but it kind of brings you into the time period. It kind of makes you think of where Japan was at the time, what the popular culture was like at the time, etc, etc. So really interesting from that perspective, but it's also really interesting to see how manga itself was developing. Because, as I said at the beginning, manga was mainly 4-panel comics. It was gag manga. There were short stories, like 1-volume manga series in general, but they were kind of one and few between. The main thing was gag manga, and as the story continues, eventually it developed into the one-shot, kind of short story collection, craze. and then eventually it becomes, these like proper long stories, which is more familiar. It isn't quite what people are familiar with today, but it's more in line with what we know as manga to have become. We also get to see, how the industry itself was. Like, for example, that it was mainly, magazines and also rental shops. You go to this rental store, you'd rent out the manga, and you'd have to bring it back, or else you'd have to pay a bit of extra. If you kind of think of how, VHS stores were back in the day, or I guess DVD stores, rental stores for movies, it's kind of like that for manga at the time, which is really, really interesting. And that was one of the largest sections of manga, so that's how mangaka made their money, through these rental stores mainly, which is really, really interesting. So we see a huge amount of the time period at the time in both manga and everyday life, which I found absolutely fascinating. The characters themselves are really, really interesting as well. The fact that they're based on real people, of course, being one of the big things about it. That's not to say that the autobiography storytelling is perfect. One of the biggest things, I don't read too much of autobiographies, to be honest, so how autobiographies are told isn't necessarily, I'm not too familiar with it, I should say. And there's a couple of issues that I found in regards to, the fact that it's an autobiography. One of those is the fact that there's these arguments that begin between characters, whether it be Hiroshi's parents, or Hiroshi and his brother, or maybe some of his, co-workers. They argue, and then they kind of make up relatively fast after that. And, of course, in conventional storytelling, you would need to have like a proper, scene where they make up with each other. But, of course, when I was reading it, I was thinking to myself, I do recall getting into arguments with people, leaving it unresolved, and then I meet them next time, we just don't bring it up, and we never resolve it. So that's kind of what it reminded me of there. And not only that, because of the fact it only goes up to 1960s, there's a couple of plot threads that are developed, which aren't necessarily finished. In particular, a couple of romantic, plot threads. They kind of mention where they go later, just, in terms of words, like we meet this woman and it says, oh, so-and-so happened later. But that isn't quite as satisfying as actually seeing it happen in the story. So I do kind of wish that it went beyond 1960 a bit. Now, in terms of where the story is, like 1960 is basically up to the point where Yoshihiro Tatsumi's main involvement with the Gekiga movement ended. Beyond that, Gekiga was a big thing that everyone else kind of embraced. So Yoshihiro Tatsumi's involvement with it was lessened. Now, he still produced Gekiga manga, but he wasn't, he didn't spread it. By that point, it had become its thing. People embraced the medium, etc., etc. So from that perspective, it makes sense. And there's actually a really nice epilogue at the end of the book, which I really enjoyed, set in the 1990s. Just kind of explaining, how Yoshihiro Tatsumi, where he had gone, and what his thoughts were, which I found really, really satisfying. It's just a couple of those autobiography issues. But overall, I really, really enjoyed A Drifting Life for its storytelling. It was absolutely fantastic. Now, from its artistic perspective, it's really, really interesting. It's actually relatively simple-looking characters. Actually, this page is particularly perfect. They're pretty simple characters. They're nice looking, but they're not particularly complex or detailed. Now that's in contrast to some very, very detailed artwork for certain scenes. Like, for example, this plane here. Like, absolutely huge detail in that. But the characters themselves are relatively simple. At first, I was kind of expecting a bit more. I mean, Yoshihiro Tatsumi was the founder of the Gekiga movement, and the Gekiga movement prided itself on realistic artwork. So I was a bit taken aback at how simple these characters were looking. But after a while, it grew on me. There's because of how simple they are, the panels move on at a very nice clip, and the great levels of detail are kind of held for certain events and certain vehicles or backgrounds, which actually lends a lot of charm and likability to those panels in particular. So overall, actually, I have to say that I quite liked the art style of this series, even though it wasn't quite what I was expecting when I entered it. In the end, the art really did grab me by the end. I really do like the art style of the series. The paneling itself is a bit simple. Now, it is varied enough that, you know, it never got like repetitive or monotonous. But it wasn't, again, considering the dramatic paneling that was introduced with the Gekiga movement, I was a bit taken aback at how simple the paneling was. But it actually does work for, you know, a lot of this manga. It's not like it's action intensive. It is relatively a slow manga in that it's people talking a lot. So the paneling does work. It's varied enough that it keeps your interest. And then I guess the last thing to talk about is this is actually published by Drawn and Quarterly, which the only other thing I've gotten from Drawn and Quarterly so far is Onward Towards Our Noble Deaths from Shigeru Mizuki. They are a really, really interesting publisher in that they publish a lot of manga that, you know, a lot of other companies wouldn't necessarily be interested in. And they do a pretty good job with this release. It's a monster of a book. It's about 850 pages. The main story itself is about 820, 830 odd. And there's a pretty considerable section at the back which basically, throughout the story, they do translate certain Japanese, you know, signs and phrases, but only the bare essentials. And if you want to be able to tell what, you know, like the very background, you know, sign is, they actually do have a section in the back which, you know, explains on panel so-so, on page so-so, it is, you know, it says this, you know, it says it's this title published by this guy, etc., etc. It translates. It's a glossary essentially, just explaining, you know, what all the writings in the backgrounds are. But they're relatively inessential. Anything that is essential, they actually translate in the main story, which I find very nice. It gives you the option of being able to just read it by itself, or if you want the extra detail, being able to go to the back, which I think is a very nice compromise. There's no color pages. Which, you know, I don't think there was any color pages in the original, so that's nothing too particular. And trim size wise, it's actually pretty damn big. I mean, if I take my normal Yotsuba, it looks absolutely tiny in comparison. It's this much bigger, which, as you can see, is absolutely tremendous. Now, at the I wouldn't say it's a request, but I was talking to Archangel Manga recently, or Adam, and he was wondering what its size was in comparison to Dororo, so for his sake, I'll actually show what it looks like in comparison to Dororo. It's still pretty bigger in comparison to Dororo. Dororo is pretty small in comparison. Pretty nice. I like the fact that it's a bigger trim size because of the fact that, you know, it allows the artwork to breathe better. But the one problem with that is, considering how many pages this is, it's quite uncomfortable to hold for long periods of time. It's one of those manga which, you know, I can read for, you know, easily 100 pages, but after a while my hand will start cramping up a bit, so I need to take a break. So I'm not really sure what the solution was to that. It's just one thing that's worth mentioning. It is a very heavy book, so you will need to take breaks probably. So overall, thoughts on A Drifting Life. I absolutely really enjoyed this book. It's one of the best manga that I've read in a while. It is really, really enlightening, you know, about the time period, about how manga was. I've been seeing how these characters, you know, debate constantly on what manga is and how the manga medium should develop. It's a really, really engaging work. And that's not to say that it's flawless. As I said, you know, there's a couple of story threads that are, you know, unresolved in both in terms of arguments and of the fact that it only goes up to 1960. But I absolutely do adore storytelling, about being able to find out about the time period, about how manga developed, about, you know, how Japan was after the war. And of course the artwork itself, like, it grew on me, even though the characters were simple. Looking at the beginning, after a while, the character designs really did appeal to me, and of course I absolutely loved the realistic look of them. And I think Drawn Quarterly did a very nice presentation of this manga, even though it isn't the most comfortable thing to hold. I think they did a fair job on presenting it. So overall, I would highly recommend that you check out A Drifting Life. It's great value as well, I should say, for its huge size. It's a work that I think if you're into manga and you want to know how the manga developed, this is well worth picking up. If you're into autobiographies as well, I definitely recommend this. And if you're interested in just good storytelling, good drama, etc., etc., I would highly recommend this. Basically, I highly recommend this. I'm not really sure how... I guess if you're not into slow stories, where characters are talking all the time and the biggest worries are whether something's going to get published or sell well, in that case, maybe I wouldn't recommend this then. But overall, I highly, highly recommend A Drifting Life. Pick it up. So that's all my opinions on A Drifting Life. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe, and bye-bye.